Opening the diagonal for the king's bishop and queen immediately creates central influence, challenging white's central pawn immediately. This Sicilian gambit sparks dynamic counterplay and opens avenues for queen and bishop development. Initiating development. This knight immediately contests central squares and prepares for further expansion. Unleashing the dragon bishop. This sets up an immediate kingside fianchetto, aiming for dynamic central control. Boldly seizing central space. This thrust immediately challenges black's fianchettoed bishop and opens aggressive lines. Opening the central file instantly offers tactical avenues, but demands precise development to avoid falling behind in piece activity. Asserting central control and opening lines for your pieces. This knight leap immediately challenges black's pawn structure, developing the bishop to its most active diagonal, a fundamental Sicilian counterplay. Developing the knight to c3 fortifies the d4 square and prepares for kingside castling, initiating piece development in a robust and typical manner. Developing this knight to c6 solidifies black's central presence and prepares to contest the d4 square, a crucial pawn. Developing the bishop to e3 now aims to bolster central control, preparing for kingside castling and anticipating potential pawn advances like f4, while also keeping an eye on black's queenside expansion. Developing the knight to f6 reinforces the center and prepares for castling, a sensible continuation in this King's Indian setup. Securing the dark square bishop's influence on the long diagonal offers a dynamic attacking platform, poised to exploit potential weaknesses around black's kingside. Seizing the open diagonal with the queen immediately creates dynamic pressure, forcing white to consider its placement and potentially disrupting their development plans. Securing the monarch within its protective fortress is paramount here, paving the way for a more aggressive development of pieces toward the center and queenside. A sensible consolidation, solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to contest the center. Shifting the knight to b3 offers a flexible outpost, eyeing the queenside and potentially preparing for a future expansion, while simultaneously unblocking the c-file for further queenside piece activity. Shifting the queen to the center offers new attacking lines and supports potential pawn advances, while simultaneously increasing pressure along the c-file and preparing for castling. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure and preparing to castle is the primary aim here, ensuring king's safety before any potential central skirmishes. This subtle repositioning of the bishop opens a clear diagonal for the other bishop to develop, enhancing piece coordination for a future kingside attack. The move prioritizes defensive solidity, calmly building a stable foundation for white's forces. It avoids immediate tactical fireworks, favoring a slower, more positional build-up, aiming to outmaneuver black through superior piece placement. By tucking the bishop away, white ensures it remains protected from potential threats on the queenside, a wise precaution in this dynamic Sicilian setup. Castling now brings the king to a safer haven, away from the central fray and initiating development of the rook, preparing to contest open files should they arise. This aggressive pawn thrust fundamentally reshapes the kingside structure, aiming to seize initiative by creating a powerful attacking spearhead. The knight on d4 is now excellently supported, and the f-file is being primed for potential future infiltration, directly threatening black's castled king. Black must be acutely aware of the pawn chain white is constructing, as it hints at a potential kingside assault, forcing a careful reassessment of defensive resources. Consider the implications for piece mobility. White's move, while ambitious, might also create minor weaknesses that a sharp opponent can exploit if not adequately defended. Securing the queenside flank and potentially disrupting white's piece development forms the core of this defensive maneuver, aiming to prevent immediate kingside pressure and create a more balanced pawn structure. Seizing the queenside initiative, white aims to disrupt black's potential pawn advances and perhaps exploit the semi-open A file for future pressure. A daring pawn sacrifice unfolds, aiming to pry open lines and disrupt white's harmonious piece development. The knight, now aggressively positioned on the 4th rank, eyes the vulnerable queen's side and potentially prepares a swift infiltration into white's territory, creating a dynamic imbalance. Liberating the rook from its defensive post on f2 now allows it to participate in the central battle, aiming to control the now open f-file and potentially support a pawn push on the kingside or even join in a queenside attack if circumstances permit. Unleashing a pawn thrust into the center, black decisively challenges white's advanced knights and attempts to seize newfound central space, potentially disrupting white's kingside development and opening lines for counterplay. Shifting the bishop to f3 strengthens the kingside defense and prepares to potentially contest the now open diagonal towards black's castled king, while also eyeing potential advances on the queenside should the opportunity arise. The bishop now finds a more active diagonal, eyeing the queenside and preparing for potential central thrusts, while simultaneously bolstering the defense of the d6 pawn and freeing the knight on c6 to potentially reposition. Preparing to reroute the rook, aiming to activate it on the d-file and potentially support a d5 pawn push, while also clearing the way for the f-pawn's onward advance. Black's rook now takes up residence on the d-file, a typically vital artery in many positions, aiming to contest white's imposing presence there and prepare for potential pawn thrusts that might open lines towards white's king. Securing the king's safety with a prophylactic retreat, this maneuver clears the g-file for potential future pawn storms or rook activations, subtly shifting the game's focus towards piece play and central control. Black's bishop on c6, previously a passive observer, now aims to establish a robust diagonal presence, subtly influencing the d5 square and potentially preparing for a later advance of the c-pawn or even a tactical skirmish on the queenside. The queenside rook suddenly abandons its post, offering a potential pawn break with e4 to black. Sensing an opportunity to improve piece harmony, black steers the knight toward the center, aiming to establish a stronger presence on d7 where it can support both the e5 pawn and potentially reroute to f6 or c5 if circumstances allow. Opening the kingside initiative with f5 immediately creates imbalanced pawn structures and seeks to pry open lines for white's pieces, potentially exposing the black king if black is not careful. Black shores up the d6 pawn and prepares to expand on the queenside with the intention of contesting the a-file or even launching a pawn storm of their own, fortifying the central pawn chain and securing the d-file for a potential future advance. This maneuver readies the rook for active participation, perhaps supporting a d5 push or joining in on the kingside if an opportunity arises, while simultaneously ensuring the defense of the e4 pawn. Black is daring to intrude into white's territory, eyeing the potentially undefended kingside and seeking to activate a dormant knight. This maneuver, however, risks overextension and could leave the central pawns vulnerable if white can consolidate and exploit the pawn structure. The pressure black aims to build on the queenside is considerable, but it comes at the cost of potentially weakening the d6 pawn. It's a bold decision, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and force concessions. The game is transitioning into a more complex middle game where precise calculation and positional Understanding will be paramount. Will this knight prove to be a disruptive force? Or will it become isolated and a target for white's counterplay? This knight leap aggressively stakes a claim on the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's developing harmony and potentially exploit weaknesses around the queenside pawns. White now threatens to fork the queen and a rook if black isn't careful, forcing a rethinking of black's defensive setup and creating immediate tactical possibilities. Seeking to activate the queen and potentially challenge the central structure, black repositions their monarch's key defender to a more dynamic square, hinting at a desire to disrupt white's central grip and perhaps prepare for a pawn thrust on the kingside or simply to find a safer haven. Spotting that undefended pawn on d6, white aggressively snatches it, immediately disrupting black's queenside pawns and creating an outpost for the knight. This bold pawn grab might also open lines towards black's king if black isn't careful with the ensuing pawn exchanges. The queen's sudden detour to c2, appearing to hunt a pawn, creates an immediate cascade of tactical possibilities, highlighting a fascinating interplay of defense and attack that could unravel the entire position. The recapture of the pawn, initiated by the knight, opens up the c-file and challenges black's now exposed queen. The recapture on e3, while seemingly a simple material recovery, introduces a fascinating positional shift, potentially opening lines of attack that black might not have anticipated so early, while simultaneously weakening white's central pawn structure and creating potential targets on d6 and f4. All of which demands careful consideration of piece activity versus pawn integrity. The queen repositions to a more active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs on the kingside while maintaining crucial defensive coverage of the d6 pawn. Black finally concedes the central pawn structure, creating a rather compromised pawn island on the queenside in exchange for liberating the bishop and potentially activating the rook on the now semi-open c-file. This decision sacrifices pawn integrity for a glimmer of activity, forcing white to be vigilant against potential discovered attacks or even a subtle regrouping that could exploit the slightly distorted pawn formation. The immediate consequence is a more open position, which could be a double-edged sword for both sides, demanding precise calculation and positional understanding. The bishop repositions, seeking a more active diagonal to support a potential kingside advance and control key central squares, while also eyeing the vulnerable pawn structure on the queenside. A bold grab for material. This knightless knight exchange has given black a pawn and temporarily cleared the way to white's queen. But it also creates immediate vulnerabilities along the newly opened queenside diagonal and potentially weakens the pawn chain's integrity. This pawn advance aims to liberate the beleaguered queenside, preparing to contest the open c-file and perhaps establish a new outpost for the knight on c5. The bishop retreats to a passive square, seemingly content to wait out the storm on the queenside. Clearing the bishop's diagonal, this maneuver liberates the c4 square, aiming to bolster the center and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, while simultaneously restricting black's queen's influence. Instantly grabbing that open file with the pawn is an ambitious attempt to disrupt white's bishop pair and potentially open lines. But it risks overextension if white can consolidate their central pawn majority and pressure your weakened queenside. Spotting the opportunity to activate your bishop and prepare for potential pawn breaks. Sacrificing the rook here initiates a dramatic positional gamble, aiming to shatter white's central pawn structure and open lines for counterplay, though it leaves the king's immediate vicinity somewhat exposed. Seizing the material advantage now decisively shapes the board, creating a significant imbalance that black must urgently address or face a swift defeat. The rook finally finds an active post on the fourth rank, threatening to infiltrate white's position along that open file. Cracking open the king's defenses, white initiates a decisive attack by sacrificing a pawn to expose black's monarch and unleash the powerful rook. Opening up the h-file presents immediate danger to the king, forcing a vigilant watch on the pawn structure's integrity and how the now exposed monarch might become a target for opposing pieces venturing through the newly formed corridor. The pawn advances, opening a vital diagonal for the rook and creating an immediate target on the queenside, forcing black to react to the altered pawn structure and threatening to isolate their remaining pawns. Regaining that bishop opens up a vital avenue for your attack along the a-file, aiming to dismantle white's pawn structure and create dangerous threats against the king's defenses. By utilizing the discovered attack potential, seizing the open file with the rook is a clear priority, aiming to directly challenge black's material advantage and centralize a powerful piece. A bold attempt to reanimate the queen, seeking influence over the d-file and potentially creating counterplay along the rank, though it leaves the king somewhat exposed to further white advances. The bishop's relocation to d5 creates a potent diagonal, eyeing the vulnerable kingside and potentially trapping the opponent's last rook. Bishops now eye each other across a chaotic battlefield, a silent duel about to commence. The rook sacrifice dramatically alters the board's landscape, aiming to dismantle black's imposing pawn structure on the queenside and open critical lines for white's remaining pieces. By giving up material, white is betting on the initiative and the long-term positional advantages gained from black's fractured defense, potentially leading to a strong passed pawn or a decisive attack on the king. Black finally consolidates material, accepting the exchange sacrifice and aiming to exploit the exposed white king in the open files that will soon develop. Liberating the queen's rook from its defensive shackles allows it to become an active participant, directly threatening the newly created queenside pawn majority while simultaneously securing the vital 7th rank. The queen is venturing deep into enemy territory, eyeing the exposed kingside pawns and potentially creating mating threats if the white king can't find adequate shelter amidst the open lines. Opening the f-file with this rook exchange could unlock crucial attacking lines against black's exposed king, forcing a re-evaluation of their defensive setup. The bishop's retreat to f4, though seemingly passive, prepares for a potential infiltration along the open files and aims to disrupt white's king's safety by drawing attention to the dark squares around it. Initiating a slow advance of the kingside pawns now offers some breathing room, potentially creating a protected passed pawn while simultaneously shoring up the king's defenses against any immediate threats from black's bishop and queen. Unleashing a bold strike, this queen ventures deep into enemy territory, aiming to destabilize white's kingside structure by threatening to expose the king's defenses with a potential checkmate or decisive mating net. Reinforcing the rook's presence on the first rank now, a surprisingly patient step, suggests a deeper plan to either double rooks or prepare a daring kingside advance after. Consolidating material equality, as the opponent's bishop pair poses a lingering threat. A daring exchange that severs white's pawn chain, sacrificing material for potential counterplay. But it relies heavily on precise follow-up to avoid being simply down an exchange for nothing. Royal check is a desperate attempt to disrupt the enemy king's shelter and potentially salvage a lost position, forcing a change in the immediate tactical landscape.